Greetings and welcome to session 52 on the Gospel of John. I'm Pastor Timothy Muse, lead pastor here at St. Paul's Lutheran Church in Alliance, Ohio. It's a joy to be with you today. I want to thank you for coming out and being part of this. I want to thank you for investing your time and your willingness to study the Bible, to be involved in the Word. It is the greatest gift that we actually have God's Word and we have access to it. Many of our brothers and sisters around the world, they study it in secret. They study it in hiding because the Bible is illegal. It is the most published book in the world, but it's also the most illegal book in the world. It's illegal in hundreds of countries because of the life-changing nature of the gospel and the freedom that the gospel brings. So thank you for being involved in this. Thank you for investing in this. We are truly blessed to be able to study the Bible, and we are truly blessed to have access to the Word. So since we have access to the Word, we want to make sure that we use it and we live into it accordingly, and we take advantage of this. So thank you for taking advantage of this time today. Thank you for taking advantage of the work. It's a joy to be part of your journey, part of your life fulfillment. So thank you for that. Thank you for investing this time. And I would certainly encourage you to share it out there. Get it out there in the hands of others. You know, this Bible study is posted every week through our social media platform, through Facebook and Instagram, through the church's Facebook and Instagram account. So I would definitely encourage you to share it out there. Get it out there so that others can experience it, so that others can hear it and understand it. It is by that gift that we're able to do what we do. So please share it out there on your social media platform. Share it out there. Subscribe to my YouTube channel because it all runs through my YouTube channel. So when something new comes up on the YouTube channel, then you can know it and you can follow it. So I would encourage that. And I would also encourage you to share that YouTube channel with others so that they can experience the Word. If this is your first time with us, and welcome. I would encourage you to stay and enjoy the session. It is the 52nd session, so there's been 51 before us, obviously, and we've walked through the Gospel of John up to this point. But you don't need to leave this session. If this is your first time being here, then welcome. You don't need to leave this session. You can stay. You can be involved in it. And then I would encourage you to go back and listen to some of the other sessions that lead up to this point. It's definitely worth it, obviously, because I'm producing it, I'm putting it forward. I feel that it is definitely worth the opportunity to do this. So put it out there, stay involved, stay connected, but then go back and hear some of the other ones. And if you're returning once again, then thank you for coming back. It's great to have you as part of the process. I certainly would welcome you back and encourage you to keep hold and keep moving forward. It's awesome. So thanks for being here and thanks for being part of this. So I would encourage you always to have your Bible open before you if you can. If you're listening to this while doing something else, while working in the yard or driving or what have you, obviously you can't do that. But if you can have the Bible open before you, I definitely would encourage it. Having the Bible open, it teaches us how to read the Bible, how to engage the Bible, how to interact with the Bible. A lot of times, people don't. That's not really taught. I shouldn't say people don't know how to, because I think they do. I think a lot of people do. They fall out of practice. Studying the Bible is like anything else. The more you practice it, the more capable you are. The more you have routine with it, the more you can engage in it. So I definitely would encourage you to read the Bible. Have it open before you so you can read it, so you can follow along. That'd definitely be a bonus and a gift for you and for those who interact with you, so you can read the Bible. It doesn't matter what translation or paraphrase you use. You can use the New Revised Standard Version, which is what I use, or you can use the New International Version, or paraphrase like the Message, or anything of that nature, the Message, Living Bible, Good News Bible. Those are all paraphrases. And a paraphrase, it tries to stay close to the original translation, but it rewrites it so it's a little easier to understand. So sometimes you're going to find in a paraphrase where it's going to stray from the translation because the English language doesn't have words that actually work for those circumstances. And that's part of the challenges when you move from language to language, is that one language isn't always compatible with another. Grammar, sentence structure, vocabulary. So if you have one language that isn't real compatible with another, translations become choppy and they become a little more difficult to understand. So a paraphrase takes a translation and then also molds it into language that's understandable. And I think, like, on a daily reading, on a daily interaction, using a paraphrase can be something very powerful because then, it makes it a little easier to read. I work with a translation when I'm doing my hermeneutic work, when I'm doing my all my other work, because it's not easier, but it's better. It's closer to the original language. And that helps me. And that's also what we use in the lectionary. We use the New Revised Standard Version in the lectionary at the church. So, but I would, whatever, whether it's a paper or digital, that's up to you. However that works for you is fine. It doesn't have to be one or the other. There's no gold standard here. We are in a digital age, and as in a digital age, we have access to the Bible in multiple forms, written, both paper and digital. So I would encourage you to use whatever access you have. Use it, take advantage of it, live into it, however you can, whatever you've got going on. So that's that. All right. And at the end of the episode, my contact information will come up. If you want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to interact with you, however that interaction may be. So feel free to, use that information accordingly. So once again, so it's great to have you with us. Thank you for that. We're going to jump in here. Now, we're in the Gospel of John. John is the fourth book of the New Testament. The Old Testament leads up from Genesis all the way up to the end of the prophets. And that's the story of God's creation and the fall of humanity and the rise of the people of God and the fall and the separation. The New Testament kicks in with the birth of Jesus, the coming of the Messiah, and goes all the way through the beginning of the new church up to the end time and rebirth. And we're in the Gospel of John. John, gospel means good news, so this is good news of Jesus Christ according to St. John. So John is the fourth book of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are the synoptics, they really coincide in a lot of ways in their story and their timeline. And then John, it tells a lot of the same stories, but kind of stands alone in timeline and expectation. So that's how we get where we are. All right. So fourth book, Gospel of John, we're in the chapter 19. So we are really, really embedded into the passion narrative at this point in time. We are really embedded in the passion work at this point. So that's where we will engage. Jesus has been arrested. He is in the midst of his trial. He is in the midst of everything that's taken place. So that's where we're going to pick up with chapter 19 in the Gospel of John. Okay, so this is chapter 19, verse 1 and following. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him in the face. Pilate went out and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Take him yourself and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he is claimed to be the Son of God." So as we are in this, we've seen that Pilate has no desire to execute Jesus. Pilate has no desire to kill Jesus. Pilate has no desire to be a puppet to the chief priests and the Pharisees and the scribes. He has no desire for Rome to be a puppet. It's kind of a fascinating thing because the occupying force, which is the Romans, they're the ones that force the Israelites into kind of the puppet subservient status. Pilate's job is to make sure that there's peace, but also that the Israelites pay their taxes. Well, fascinatingly enough, at this point in time, Pilate and the Romans are being the puppeteer. They're being the puppets to the Jews. The Jews want to use the Romans' power to execute Jesus and resolve their own issues. Pilate has no interest in this. Pilate has no interest in being used like this. Now, Pilate's not a nice man. So Pilate is not a good man. All right, he's just a smart politician, and he sees that if he does this, then it can be seen that maybe he is being a puppet to the Jews. So he doesn't crucify Jesus, he doesn't kill Jesus or execute Jesus, but what he does do is he has Jesus flogged. Now, a flogging, we hear this word from time to time, but a flogging basically is a whip of cords. It's leather straps, and there's multiple, and usually at the end of the cord, and sorry, this is going to get a little gruesome, but there's like pieces of glass or bits of bone or stone that are tied on to the end of these cords. So, I mean, it's not just enough to get a whip. It's not just enough to get whipped. But every time one of these things, one of these shards of glass, you can imagine. I mean, just use your imagination. Now, I don't have to tell you what it would be like to be flogged. It's brutal. It is brutal. It is not meant to be a death blow, but you have a hard time living after this because of just the amount of damage that is done to the human body in this. So Pilate is a very brutal man, and Pilate does a very brutal thing. He has Jesus flogged, okay, which is pretty much beaten within an inch of his life. So Jesus is flogged. He is left in this place of pain and brokenness and bloodiness. And on top of that, soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they dressed him in a purple gown. So they're mocking him, of course. So it's not just physical torture, but it's also emotional, mental, and psychological torture. These people were very brutal. And we want to make sure that we're clear when we talk about a crown of thorns. This was not just like placed on his head like what we saw in the coronation of King Charles here a couple months ago. No, this thing was put on the head and then pressed down. Those thorns pressed into the scalp. Okay, this was meant to be painful. This was meant to be humiliating. This was meant to lead someone almost to the point of death. That was the whole point of this. There was no hope of just, someone learning a little lesson here. No, this was meant to be brutal. Not life-threatening, but pretty darn close. If someone died from their injuries, well, then so be it. But they weren't executed, if you will. They were just beaten, and then their body collapsed, and they died. Okay, so Pilate is brutally beating Jesus, mocking him. So it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual torture. All right, and this is typical of Rome. And I think what Pilate is doing here is Pilate is doing twofold thing here. And again, none of this really has to do anything with Jesus. Okay? Jesus is just kind of the bystander in all this. None of this really has to do anything with Jesus. Jesus just happens to be the one that's paying the price for this action. So first step is that Pilate is doing a little bit of peacekeeping, a little bit of negotiation here. He's not necessarily killing Jesus, but he's beating Jesus up pretty good. And showing, a little bit of olive branch here with the rest of with the Jews, but also Pilate is showing the level of his brutality, and what he will not tolerate. So sooner or later, the Israelites, those who are in charge, Herod and the chief priests and the temple police, they all need to understand that they're only a few steps away from receiving such torture themselves. So Pilate is creating a little bit of balance, but he is also reminding them of his brutality. Not that they needed that reminding, but, sometimes, people start to rise up and they need to be reminded of their place. So that's what Pilate is doing. Pilate is not only giving a little bit of peace, but Pilate is also expressing a good deal of brutality and reminding the Jews that he won't tolerate such puppeteering, if you will. So Jesus not only is flogged, but the soldiers wove the crown of thorns, put it on his head, dressed him in a purple robe. So the soldiers are mocking the Jews. They're mocking Jesus. They're mocking the whole thing. They're mocking God. This is all one big mock that's coming forward here. The Jews are being mocked on all levels. And then they kept coming up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him in the face. So you would never do that with a king. A king would never be subject to such torture, such humiliation, if you will. So here is Jesus, and in turn the Jews. Okay, so it's not just Jesus, but it's also the Jews who are being humiliated and made fun of. It is also the Jews who are being beaten down and subject to this. It's not just Jesus. And as a matter of fact, Jesus, like I said, is kind of the vehicle for this. He isn't even the one who is really getting the punishment. He is the vehicle. Well, he's getting the punishment, but it's really not about him. He is the vehicle to punish the Jews. So Pilate and the rest of the Romans are doing this. Then after doing this, Pilate went out and said to them, look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him. Y'all are a bunch of idiots. I see no reason to hurt this man, to kill this man. I mean, and he really had no reason to hurt him either, except that Pilate's brutal and a bloodlust. So, I've got no reason to kill this man, so I'm not gonna execute him. I'm gonna bring him out. I'm gonna bring him out to you. I find no case against him. Y'all are a bunch of jealous idiots. Is what Pilate is concluding here. So I'm gonna bring him out. Look, we beat him. We're mocking him. We're making fun of him, and we're making fun of you because you're a bunch of idiots. But here you go. Here is your king. Here is the man. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, here is the man. Here he is. Here is your fear. And now, I mean, and this is a mocking because, I mean, think about it. Here's the chief priests and the scribes, and they're all afraid of this Jesus. They want to bring him before Pilate. They want Pilate to execute him. Yada yada yada. They're all afraid of him. And what is he doing? What is he? He's like, look, here's this beaten, broken man. What are you so afraid of? Why are you afraid of him? Why are you worried about him? Here is the man. Here is your king. Here is the object of your fear. How powerful that is. How incredible it is to see Jesus be used as a symbol of mocking by Pilate towards the Jews. So Pilate brings Jesus out. Here is the one you're so afraid of. Here is the man. Well, when the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate said, take him yourself and crucify him. I find no case against him. So again, the Jews are using, the chief priests and the temple police, they are using Pilate as the hammer against Jesus, as against God, against the work of God in the world. Crucifixion, by its very nature, it's not invented by the Romans. Let's just begin there. Crucifixion is an old Persian action. The Romans took it, and of course, like in any Roman fashion, brutalized it, so they made it far worse. And then they use it for political prisoners. Okay, they use it for political prisoners. They use it for political uprising. So, and there's a point. There's a double point. Rome isn't going to tolerate any kind of political usurper. They're not going to tolerate any kind of rebellion. As I had said and talked about in the book of Revelation, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse is internal strife. Rome is terrified of internal strife. So they use crucifixion as a way to express its intolerance for eternal strife, its intolerance for rebellion, if you will. So here is Rome using this old form of execution from the Persians, brutal, and there would have been crosses outside the gates of Jerusalem for people who, as a reminder, if you're coming in here, don't come in here as a rabble rouser. Don't come in here in a rebellious fashion. That's going to be unacceptable. So, and that's what, and crucifixion did that. It reminded people that there is not going to be any of this tolerance of rebellion. So the Jews they're actually claiming Jesus to be a political usurper. They're touching on, again, and they're very smart, they're touching on what the Romans would have most feared. They're calling Jesus a political usurper, a political rebel. They're pitting Jesus against the Romans. And notice what they, so they say, crucify him, and Pilate says, take him yourself and crucify him. I find no case against him. I have no reason to crucify him. I have no reason to kill him. Now let's keep in mind, again, Pilate's brutal. The Romans are brutal. Brutality is not something that Pilate is afraid of. And Pilate would have crucified Jesus in a heartbeat. There wouldn't even be this conversation, except for the fact that Pilate doesn't have a case against Jesus. Now, why does this matter? Well, the Romans did have a sense of justice. They don't have a problem killing people for breaking the law, but they're just not going to go out and kill people. There is a sense of justice to this. They want some form of justice when this is all taking place. So Pilate needs to have a reason to crucify him. It can be a little reason, but Pilate still needs to have a reason, and he doesn't. He sees no case against Jesus from the Jews. So he's like, you crucify him. You take him. You do this. Well, crucifixion is not part of Jewish custom or Jewish punishment. As a matter of historical record, crucifixion doesn't show up in the Bible until Jesus, in this moment, in Jesus' interaction with Pilate and the chief priests and the Pharisees. So this is really the first that crucifixion shows up in biblical text, in the biblical narrative, even though, I mean, it's hundreds of years old, of course. But this is the first that it shows up in the biblical text, is in reference to Jesus and how Jesus will be put to death. So, they're crying out, crucify, crucify. He is a political prisoner. Again, these guys are not dumb. They know how to play this game. They know how to tug on the fear strings of the Romans, and that's what they're doing. They're tugging on the fear strings. He's a political usurper. He's going to bring down the country. We have a law. And according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God. Okay, so claim to be the Son of God. Why is this an issue? The Romans aren't monotheistic. They're not Yahwists. They're not Jews. Why would they care? Well, there would be a care because the emperor, the Roman emperor, is claimed to be God's son. Okay? The Roman emperor is proclaimed as the Son of God. So now you have this guy dressed in purple, flogged almost to an inch of his life, wearing a crown of thorns, who's claiming to be the Son of God. All right? Pilate finds no case against this guy, but he's claiming to be the Son of God. He's claiming to be the one given over by God. Now, this is a problem. Because, well, the emperor is, the Son of God, and no one stands up against the emperor. No one stands up against the Roman emperor. So now we have a quandary. Pilate finds no case against him. He finds no case, but there's also the question of, does Jesus actually claim this? Does Jesus actually claim to be the Son of God? Or are they using this as a tool, as a weapon? I mean, remember, Pilate really has no background or no backing in Jesus. So is he really claiming to be the Son of God? Because if he is claiming to be the Son of God, then he is a usurper trying to take over, and he should be put to death. There's no doubt. That would be it. But Pilate has no recollection of this. He has no knowledge of this. He's not following Jesus. He's just taking the words of these jealous idiots over here who want to see someone raising up, put to death, and wants to see the Romans as the hammer to do it. So Pilate needs more. Pilate's no longer just he knows that there's an issue. He wants this issue to be resolved quietly, but if need be, he will execute. That's just how Pilate works. So, all right, so this is verse 8 and following. Now, when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given from above. Therefore, the one handing me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." All right, so Pilate hears this. Pilate hears what is being said. He's more afraid than ever, as the text tells us. He's more afraid than ever. So he goes back in. He's like, "All right, where are you from? What's going on? Let's dig in here. Tell me how you are a king. Tell me how you are the one who should be honored. Are you a king? And if so, how? Where are you from? Which is a pretty standard statement. Where are you from? Well, that would definitely give credence to like a royal lineage or a royal bloodline. And that's what Pilate wants to know. Do you have a royal bloodline? Are you from royalty? Are you from royalty that we need to be paying attention to? Again, and with the fear of the Romans, if Jesus claims royalty, they'll put him to death. Because, the Romans don't want to monkey around with royalty. Especially royalty that may rise up and take over. But Jesus gives no response. Jesus says nothing. He gives no answer. Jesus will no longer dialogue with this. He will no longer interact with this involvement. Jesus gives no answer, which is really, really frustrating. I think for everybody involved, it's really, really frustrating because Jesus could answer, but he doesn't. He's no longer willing to be part of this. He took the beating, he took the robe, he took the crown of thorns. He is no longer willing to be part of this charade, if you will, part of this trial, this mocking. Let's get on with it. So in his refusal to speak, Pilate, reverts back to what anybody who's frustrated does. They threaten. Pilate threatens Jesus. Do you not know? Do you not know? Do you refuse to speak to me? You don't want to speak to me anymore. Are you refusing to speak? Are you refusing to testify on your own behalf? Are you refusing to defend yourself in any way against the charges that are being brought against you? Do you refuse to speak? Do you not know? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you? Now, Pilate is functioning under the idea that he is in charge here. And that's always, whenever a human stands in the face of God and functions under the idea that they're in charge, that's usually a bad idea because, well, humans are never in charge. We're never in charge of God. God does what God does. God is God and we are not. So we're never in charge of God. God is in charge of God. God is in charge of everything taking place. And we, as humans, though we have the capability of making some decisions and moving forward, we are not in charge. And we should never think that we are in charge. Not for a minute. Not for a minute. Because if we think that we are in charge, then we're missing the point of submission and servanthood. We're missing the point of our role in the midst of creation. And our role. Now, we may be in the top of creation, but we are far from the courts of the divine. So Pilate is taking this control thing. Do you understand that I'm in control of your future? I can release you. I can crucify you. I've already beaten you, even though you don't deserve it. I find no case against you, but I had you flogged. You're being mocked. So I'm in complete control here. And Jesus, you're not in control. You have no power over me. You wouldn't have power over me except given from above. The only reason why you have power over me is because this is how it has to happen. You're being granted this power. You don't get to take it. You didn't get to earn it. You're being granted this power. You're being granted this power because humanity has fallen and is broken and sick and sinful. You're being granted this power because I have to die for the sake of the world. So if you want somebody to say who's in control, it ain't you, buddy. You're just an instrument. So now Pilate not only is an instrument of the Jews, but he's also an instrument of God. And it's fascinating because whenever we think about an instrument of God, we think positive, okay? We always think positive when we think about instruments of God, but that's not always the case. Pilate is an instrument of God here because the only way that Jesus is going to die is by Pilate executing him. And so Pilate is an instrument of God. Pilate is a form of God's work, just like the Babylonians. Again, when we think about the Babylonians in the Old Testament, when we think about the Babylonian captivity in the Old Testament, we want to think that, evil wins and that the Babylonians overcame. No, God gave permission for the Babylonians to win. God gave permission for the Babylonians to take over and take the tribes away because that was part of the deal. Well, so is this. Jesus must die for the sake of the world. Jesus must die for the sake of humanity. So with that being the case, there needs to be a vehicle. It's not just Jesus dying of old age. It's Jesus being executed wrongly for the sake of the world. Just like Judas, who needed to be used to identify Jesus, so then also is Pilate, who has to be the trigger to execute Jesus. But Jesus is like, look, the only reason why you have power, dude, is because it was given to you from above. It was given to you by God. God gave you the power over me. You didn't take it. You didn't earn it. You didn't get it. God gave it to you. You have this power because God gave it to you. Let us not mistake for a minute the role that you have. So if anybody should be held accountable, if anybody should be held to task, it should be God. That God would require such a thing, that God would use such a manipulative, brutal individual such as yourself. If anybody needs to be held accountable, it would be God. It would be the one who handed me over, guilty of a greater sin. Now, that's fascinating words. That's fascinating words when we hear Jesus talking about God being guilty of a greater sin. And that, obviously God is sinless. That is the whole point. That's what makes God God. That's why we cannot be like God, because we are sinful. Not to say that God isn't justified in what God is doing. God is perfectly justified in this. God is perfectly justified in this action. God is God after all. But what the fact of the matter is, what's being looked at here, what's being talked about here, isn't that God isn't justified in this. That's not it. But if this is meant to be seen as sinful, then God is. If this is a power play, if this is meant to be seen as sinful, then God is the greater sinner. But this has to happen. This is the course of the Messiah. This is the project. This is the work. So because this is the work, because this has to happen, because Christ is going to die for the sake of the world, somebody has to kill him. Somebody has to pull the trigger. Somebody has to be the executioner. And it turns out to be Pilate. Pilate gets to have that role. Pilate gets to be that guy. He gets to be the one to lower the boom, if you will, or whatever metaphor, pull the trigger, or, push him off the cliff, or whatever metaphor you want to use. Pilate has to be that guy. It's Pilate's job to do that. Pilate and nobody else. That's who God has ordained for this. God has ordained Pilate to live down in history as the one who executed the Messiah. He doesn't want to, but he sees the tide of power turning here. So you have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over is of greater guilt. From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out. So from then on, Pilate tried to get rid of him. Pilate didn't want to do this. This is something that we really need to understand. Pilate didn't want to execute Jesus. Okay? Pilate didn't want to execute Jesus. He did not want to kill Jesus. He did not want Jesus to be executed. All right. He wanted this problem to go away. He wanted the Jews to be happy, everything go back to the way it was. Pilate didn't want to do this, but he was being put in a place where he really had to. But he kept trying to release Jesus. He kept trying to find new and different ways to cut this guy loose, to be done with this circumstance and move on to whatever party or celebration or whatever that was taking place. Okay. So Pilate kept trying. He knew that this was out of jealousy. He knew this was out of fear. He knew this was out of their inability to see beyond their own selfish noses. He knew that that's why the Pharisees and the temple police had brought Jesus to him. So he kept trying to cut Jesus loose. He kept trying to move Jesus away, push him out, get rid of this issue. But every time that he did, the Jews would cry out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor." Everyone who claims to be a king has set himself against the emperor. Now, notice, Jesus never claims himself to be a king. The claim to the Son of God is not a claim of kingship, okay? But, and Pilate's, really kind of in a catch-22 here, because if he lets Jesus go, then he is seen as, standing against the emperor. And what would happen would be Pilate would be killed. If the emperor found out that Pilate was harboring someone who claimed to be a king, well, then Pilate would be killed. The emperor would just have him executed. Again, and somebody else would be put in place. It'd be a business deal. It's like selling a piece of property. It'd be a business deal. Pilate be executed and that be that. Pilate wants to live a long, full, and prosperous life in the region that he's living, and maybe even higher up. So Pilate doesn't want to do anything to even intone the possibility that he would harbor some kind of rebellious manifestation. So there's that. He doesn't want that, but he also knows that these people are wanting to kill this man because they're jealous. They're jealous. So he doesn't want to be a puppet, but he's in a very difficult spot. He doesn't want to be a puppet to the Jews, but he doesn't want word to get back to the emperor that maybe there is a king being harbored in the regions of Jerusalem under Pilate's reign. Because Pilate be executed, somebody else come in, wipe the place out, and that be that. Pilate doesn't want that. Pilate is enjoying the spoils of war, so he's really in a catch-22. And the Jews are using this leverage. The Jews have no, and here's the thing: the Jews have no love for the emperor. The Jews don't care. The only reason why the Jews care about the emperor is there's relative peace. But the Jews don't care. They don't care in the least. They don't care in the least about it. But they see the pressure of using allegiance to the Roman emperor as a tool, as a weapon. So, you see them selling out their all of their moral and ethical basis. You see them selling themselves out, really, for power. And that's what power does. And I think that's what's really, really important, is that when someone gains power, they'll sell out in order to maintain that power. And that's what the Jews did. The Jews are currying favor. They want to stay in good with the Romans. They want to keep the power of the temple. So they're using the Roman emperor as a weapon against a prophet. They're using the Roman emperor as a weapon against their own. And that's unacceptable. That's not how it's supposed to be. That's not faithful living. That's not a faithful expression. They're using the Roman emperor when they have no care. They have no allegiance. But look, if this Roman emperor falls, the next one rises up. I mean, whoever's in charge isn't going to benefit them in any way, shape, or form. That's just not how it works. And again, God is using this perfect storm of fear, of power hungry. I mean, God is using all of this to get to the objective end of the Messiah. Again, keep in mind, as I've said this many times, it's really, really important to understand there is no mistake here. This is not an accident. Jesus didn't fall into a trap. This is all ordained by the divine. This is all planned by God. God is orchestrating all of this. So since God is orchestrating all of this, since God is overseeing all of this, since God is dealing with all of this, then God is using both the power-hungry desiring of the chief priests and the police and the fear of Pilate. God is using all of that for the sake of saving the world, which is really, really fascinating. I think it's really, really great, because neither the chief priests and temple police or Pilate or the Roman emperor care about the world. But God is taking something so awful, so painful, so broken, and using it for something so beautiful. How incredible that is. How incredible it is that God works in such a way. That God would take something so icky and turn it into something so incredible. That's just how God works. That's what God does. That's what makes God God, if you will. That's what makes God God and us not, is that God can see potentiality and God can work through potentiality, even when we're like, it doesn't make any sense. So part of the work is trusting in God. Part of the work is trusting God, even when it doesn't look like trusting God is a good idea. Okay. Part of the work is trusting God, even when it doesn't look like trusting God is the best play. It doesn't look like it's the easiest. So Jesus walks into all of this trusting that God's going to make it all work out. That's why he says nothing. That's why there's no statement. That's why there's no fighting for his life, fighting for his freedom. Jesus has put his life in God's hands, and God is going to tend to it accordingly. But the Jews are using Pilate's fear of Roman rebellion, of losing his place. They're using his fear as a pressure point. Pilate is using the Jews' fear of power as a pressure point. And they all think they're winning in the end, but they're all losing. And that's the funny part is, Pilate and the Jews all think that in the end they're winning, but they're all losing. This is all a loss. But Pilate sees the writing on the wall, if you will. Pilate sees what needs to happen. So let's continue on a little bit more and go ahead and wrap up this portion of the Passion. This is verse 13. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of the Passover. It was the day of the preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, "Here is your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. All right, so this is kind of like the final moment, the final approach. So Pilate no longer, again, remember when Jesus was taken to the house of Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest. It was a backroom deal. It was meant to be a backroom deal. It was meant to deal with this quietly. Okay? Well, Pilate's trying to do the same thing. Pilate's trying to deal with this quietly. He is trying to quietly move Jesus away. He is trying to quietly end this so that Jesus and the Jews and everybody, Jesus can go off and die from his wounds. The Jews can go back to being stupid idiots in the temple. Pilate can go back to his parties or whatever, the Roman governor does, and everything's the same. All right? Pilate tried again and again and again to make this happen, and it never did. So finally, Pilate has to do this whole judgment thing. He needs to come out, and it needs to be official. All right? This is the official act. All right? This is on the record. Everything else so far has been off the record. Trying to negotiate the deal. Trying to quell this. Well, now this is on the record. This is for the record. Pilate heard these words. He brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench, a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. This is a place, this is formal judgment. Pilate sitting on the bench means that he is now the judge. It's like when the judge puts on the robe, or, at one point the powdered wig, or whatever. It's a different role. Pilate is now taking the formal role of being judge, which would be part of his role as governor, is that he would be judge. All right? So he's taking on the formal role of being judge, being governor. That's what he's doing, and he's bringing Jesus out. Now, it's preparation for the day of the Passover. All right? So it's the day before the Passover, the day of preparation. Really important day, really kind of high holy day, which is why, keep in mind, when Jesus was brought to Pilate to begin with, that the Jews didn't enter into the palace because they didn't want to be unclean. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Which is really, really fascinating. It's really, really fascinating. They want to save they want to be able to eat the Passover and worship God while at the same time they're trying to figure out a way to execute God's Son. And you talk about hypocrisy, you talk about blindness. Here are the Pharisees and the scribes, and they are wanting to keep themselves clean so they can eat the Passover. Not that the Passover means anything, because the Passover lamb's standing right before them. The very one who's going to sacrifice himself for the world is standing right before them, and yet they kill him. So they're looking to kill him, but at the same time, the Passover lamb is right there, and they want to stay clean. So the hypocrisy of it, the hypocrisy of their spirituality. Their spirituality is nothing more than function. Do the right thing, and everything will be fine. That's the hypocrisy of their spirituality. Do the right thing and everything will be fine. But it's wrong. That's a wrong form of spirituality. That's a wrong way of looking at spirituality. But do the right thing and everything will be fine. That is the function. That's the functionality of their spirituality. So it's preparation for the day of the Passover. This is a really important day. It's a very high holy day. And they want to get on with things. Okay? They want to get on with things. They want to get on with what's going on next. All right? They want to get on with preparing for the Passover. They want to finish this. So let's finish it quickly. And so they will say anything that they have to in order to finish this, and that's what they do. Now, notice that the writer of John tells us it was about noon, okay? The sun was at about the highest point of the day, and that's going to be important, later on when we get to Golgotha, when we get to the place of the skull, when we get to the crucifixion itself. Again, and we're throwing in these little time details as an important feature so that we can really enter into the story in a powerful and appropriate way. So Pilate brings out Jesus. And he says to the Jews, "Here is your king." Now, Pilate is baiting the crowd. Pilate wants the Jews to bow down. Remember, Pilate's no puppet to the puppeteers of the Jews. And that's what they were trying to get him to do. So now Pilate is pressing for allegiance. He will crucify Jesus for proclamation of allegiance. This is a game. This is a political game. And the Jews thought they were in charge. Pilate thought he was in charge. Nobody was in charge but God. But Pilate now has reversed the tables. He brings Jesus out in this very formal capacity and says, "Here is your king. Here is your king." It is time for you to identify who you're going to follow. Either this Jesus fellow or who? Caesar. That is the play. You either identify Jesus as your king or Caesar as your king, but you don't get both. So he brings Jesus out. "Here is your king." Of course, then they cry out, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." He is a usurper. He is a political usurper. Put him to death, and not just put him to death, but put him to the brutal death of being a political usurper, of being a political enemy to the state. This is he is no longer just a nuisance to us. We're going to make him an enemy of the state. And what does Pilate do now? Pilate's pressing a little bit further. Remember, Pilate's not a dumb man. Pilate's not dumb in his role, so he presses a little bit further. "Shall I crucify your king?" So, he's baiting them. He's baiting them to an allegiance. And that's the deal. If you bow down to Caesar, then I'll take care of this problem. If you publicly bow down to Caesar, I'll take care of this problem for you. You see the deal. But here's the thing. To publicly bow down to Caesar is to publicly bow down to the Roman emperor as God, which in turn kind of goes against fundamental number one, "I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other God before me." So the very ones who are tasked with bringing the word of God forward and maintaining faithfulness in the eyes of God are bartering that away. They are sacrificing that all for what? In order to have the Messiah, the Son of God, executed to keep their power. You see how awful and how ugly and how sinful this is, all based on the mix of power. This is coming because of power. Power, envy, greed. That's what's happening here. This is terrible, but this is a terrible abuse of power. That's what we're experiencing. So the chief priests answer, and here is the knife. "We have no king but the emperor. We will bow down to Caesar." We will bow down to Caesar. So the way for the Jews to eradicate Jesus is to formally proclaim the emperor as king, the emperor as God. Because that's the claim. If you claim the emperor as king, you're claiming the emperor is the Son of God. We will formally proclaim the emperor as king, the emperor as God. We will formally do that. And that's what they do. And that is the price that they pay in order to have Jesus executed. Now think about that for a minute. Think about, this is the chief priest. This is the one who has been tasked with overseeing the faithfulness of God. This is the chief priest, and they are formally proclaiming the emperor as king. They are formally proclaiming the emperor as their ruler. They are literally breaking the first commandment and the fifth commandment. I mean, they're murdering Jesus. Jesus has no reason to be put to death, but Jesus is being murdered, but he's being murdered by the weapon of the Roman Empire. So I mean, the number of the 10 commandments that are being broken in this, okay? So they've set themselves up as an idol. They're trying to honor the Sabbath day, but not really. I mean, not really. They're bearing false witness. They're coveting their own power. They're murdering Jesus. About 50% of the 10 commandments fall like dominoes in the hands of the chief priests in order to get rid of this guy. And Pilate has won the day. Pilate has now concluded. He has now identified this Jesus. He's now identified a way for the Jews to bow down to the emperor. And he's gotten them to do it. He's gotten them to proclaim the emperor as king. And for that, he will execute Jesus. If anything comes back on him, if the Roman emperor calls him for an account, he can say, look, I got these stiff-necked Jews to bow down to you. I got them to proclaim you as king. And that is what everybody wants. That is what you want. You want them to proclaim you as king. I got them to do that. And the only price I had to pay was killing some itinerant preacher that nobody cares about, right? I got them to do that. I got them to proclaim you. And that's what I wanted. That's what you wanted. So I got it. I got it for you. So we should be good. So Pilate can wash his hands of any retribution from Rome for what he did. The Jews can go ahead and, they'll figure it out. They'll lift off into obscurity now that they've bowed down to the Roman emperor. They've turned their back on God. They've said, God, you don't matter anymore. We're going to worship Rome. We're going to worship the Roman emperor. We'll eat your Passover tomorrow, but hey, whatever, we'll hold the ritual, but you really don't matter. That's really where it's at. So they're going to hold on to the ritual, but they have just turned their back on God by bowing down to the Roman emperor, which is awful, terrible, icky. And Jesus is going to be led off to death. Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So that was the price. So Jesus is the price for the negotiation, for the deal. Jesus is the price between the Jews and Rome. Jesus is the price. And the price will be paid. The price will be paid for all of it. And Jesus will pay the price. They handed him over to be crucified. He handed him over to them to be crucified. Them being the temple, the Roman police. The Jews didn't crucify. The Jews didn't do that, but Rome did. So it was the police. It was the centurions, the guards, the army's responsibility. So Jesus was handed over to be crucified to the Jews or to the Romans by Pilate. So the execution order had been given to kill him. And that was the price. The Jews got what they wanted, and Pilate got what he wanted, and God got what he wanted. The only one who really didn't get what he wanted was Jesus. Jesus didn't want to do this. Jesus was willing to do it, but we see at the Garden of Gethsemane, he didn't want to do it. He asked God to take the cup away, but God didn't. He asked God to take the cup away, but God didn't. But everybody else got what they wanted. The Jews got Jesus silenced. The Romans got the Jews to bow down to the emperor. God got the sacrificial lamb put up on the cross. Everybody got what everybody got, but Jesus. All right, so we're going to leave it here because the next event is the crucifixion event itself, and I don't want to graze over that. I want to make sure that I get plenty of time for that. So I hope this session was helpful for you. I hope that you gained something out of it. I know I kind of threw a lot at you, and certainly one of the joys of this is you can back and listen to it again if you have to. But I hope you got something out of it. I hope that it was beneficial to you. I know it's always beneficial to me to be able to dwell in the Word. As always, my contact information is going to come up at the end of the session. If you have any questions, you'd like to reach out to me in any way, please feel free to do so. And we'll be back next week with session number 53. God bless you and have a great week.